Leopoldine was born as Archduchess Maria Leopoldine Josepha Caroline on the 22nd of January 1797 in Vienna to Emperor Franz I of Austria and his second wife, Maria Theresa of Naples, Sicily. Leopoldine grew up in a loving family at the Austrian court. The costumes at the Viennese court at that time were almost bourgeois. Etiquette and ceremonial were reserved for official occasions, which allowed the imperial children to have a carefree childhood. Archduchess Leopoldine had an especially close relationship with her sisters Marie-Louise and Marie-Clementine, which would last a lifetime. As a teenager, Leopoldine was described as moderately pretty, with light blonde hair, blue eyes, and an extremely light skin. Her demeanor was said to be contradictory, as she was lively and joyful at times, and then again fearful and melancholic. Sounds like a regular teenager to me, though. One of her most outstanding characteristics was her willpower and her persistence, which would serve her later on in life. When Leopoldine was 10 years old, she lost her beloved mother, which was devastating to her. But her father remarried again soon after, and his bride, Maria Ludovica d'Este, turned out to be a loving, supportive stepmother who cared for her stepchildren. She stood by Leopoldine's side when in 1810 Leopoldine's favorite sister Marie-Louise was married off to the infamous Napoleon Bonaparte in order to keep peace with the self-proclaimed French emperor. Leopoldine was heartbroken by having to say farewell to her older sister, even though Marie-Louise returned to the Viennese court in 1814 after Napoleon was banned. The year 1816 would turn out to be a fateful one for Leopoldine. Her favorite sister Marie-Louise was sent off to her new duchy in Parma. Her other dear sister Marie Clementine was married off to Naples, and her beloved stepmother Maria Ludovica died at the age of 29. With all the tragedy and sadness that year would bring, it was also filled with rumors of a possible marriage arrangement for Leopoldine to the Dom Pedro, the Crown Prince of the United Kingdoms of Portugal and Brazil. His father, King João, resided in Brazil with his family, as he had to flee Portugal in 1807 from Napoleon. He dissolved Brazil's colonial dependency and declared it as an equal kingdom to Portugal. The desired groom for Leopoldine, Crown Prince Pedro, grew up without any form of discipline, which led him to being a difficult, conspicuous young man. He was known for his uncontrollable temper tantrums and his rampancy when it came to women and his demands. However, people thought of him to be charming and captivating at the same time. The rumors about Don Pedro's ill behavior and his possible suffering from epilepsy worried the Viennese court, but the anticipated power and wealth this connection would bring convinced the Austrian emperor and his ministers to accept the marriage proposal for her. Leopoldine herself was very excited about leaving for Brazil. She started learning the Portuguese language eagerly and read every book about Brazil that she could get her hands on. After receiving a medallion with Don Pedro's picture in it, Leopoldine was smitten with her handsome groom. After the wedding was held by procuration in Vienna, Leopoldine and her entourage set sail for Brazil in August 1817. After 3 months of strenuous travels, Leopoldine arrived in Rio de Janeiro, where she was warmly welcomed by the Brazilians and their royal family. Dom Pedro was taken with his young bride, and that feeling was mutual. The wedding ceremony was held soon after her arrival, and it was lavish. After the wedding, the couple took residency at the Boa Vista Palace near Rio. At first, Leopoldine was enchanted with her husband and her new home, with its lavish green nature and the magnificent ocean in plain sight. But soon she would come to realize just how different the Brazilian court was from her home country. The court was unorganized, loud, and immoral compared to Vienna. Moreover, the hot weather and often greasy food would take a toll on Leopoldine, but she was willing to compromise to make her husband happy. It wasn't long, though, before she found out that Pedro was having affairs on the side. While she was deeply hurt by this, she decided for herself that it was the best to submit to her husband's needs and wants, as she wanted to avoid his outbursts. Besides turning a blind eye to his infidelity, she even left her alimony to Pedro when he ran out of money. Leopoldine was deeply in love with her husband, but she could not deny his many inadequacies. Pedro was imperious and cruel with his servants, and he had violent outbursts with the slaves at court, which Leopoldine tried to compensate with all her heart. After 2 years of marriage, Leopoldine gave birth to her first child, Maria de Gloria, and she flourished in motherhood. After all, Leopoldine was very homesick, and she was hoping for the imperial family to be able to return to Portugal. In 1821, a liberal revolution broke out in Portugal, which required King João and his wife to return to Portugal, and Leopoldine was hopeful to follow them soon after. During this time, Leopoldine started to become politically involved, which her husband approved of. Things in Portugal didn't go as planned, though, as King João agreed to the Portuguese assembly in order to dissolve the Kingdom of Brazil and have it return to its colonial status. The outrage in Brazil was massive, and all eyes were on the crowned prince and princess. They were expected to return to the motherland of Portugal immediately, but both hesitated. Even though Leopoldine had wished to return to Europe, she felt obligated to the people of Brazil and their well-being. With all her persuasion, she convinced her husband Pedro to stay in Brazil. The people of Brazil were rejoicing, but the royal couple was endangered by Portuguese military, which was commanded to return them to Portugal. Leopoldine even had to flee to the countryside with her 2 children, being heavily pregnant. Tragically, her young son died soon after the escape, yet a month after she gave birth to a healthy daughter. During these trying times, the couple grew close and gave each other stability. After a lot of convincing from Leopoldine in 1822, Dom Pedro declared Brazil's independence from Portugal, and he was crowned as Pedro I, Emperor of Brazil. Leopoldine was fond of her role as a sovereign of Brazil. She fought hard to gain recognition for her country internationally, and she encouraged the settlement of European professionals in Brazil to help the economy prosper. The year 1822 was full of accomplishments for Leopoldine, but it would also mark the beginning of her great sorrows. Emperor Pedro had made a faithful encounter with a young woman called Dona Domitila. She was from a common family, separated from her husband with whom she had 3 children, and most importantly, the emperor was infatuated with her. From the day Pedro met Domitila, everything changed for Leopoldine. Pedro spent all his time and fortune on his new mistress, which resulted in their first mutual child in 1824. While Pedro had many affairs before, this one was different. Domitila had a major impact on the emperor, and she was ambitious to say the least. Pedro had his mistress and her family reside at court, and elevated many of them in high ranks. To make matters worse, Pedro introduced his mistress officially at court, and made her Leopoldine's lady-in-waiting, which humiliated her even further. Leopoldine kept her composure through all the pain inflicted by Pedro, and tried to continue the marriage in good terms. In 1825 she would give birth to another son, the future Pedro II. Her hopes to regain Pedro's affection were short-lived, as Domitilla had a son shortly after, who was named Pedro as well. Despite all the public humiliations Leopoldine had to endure, she had her husband's back, while the Brazilian people were infuriated by the emperor's behavior towards his wife. Pedro reacted by paying more attention to his wife for a short time, but at the same time he nursed his mistress's father, who had fallen ill. He even made Leopoldine join him in church to pray for Domitilla's father. After years of neglect, Leopoldine had finally had enough. In 1826, she asked Pedro to either leave his mistress or allow her to leave for Europe. This resistance infuriated the emperor, and he confronted his wife at her residency. The arguments soon became violent, as Pedro couldn't control his temper. It is likely that he was abusive towards Leopoldine before, but this time her unexpected resistance infuriated the erratic emperor even more. After this incident, Pedro's temper was unleashed, and he wasn't holding back in public anymore. The same year, the emperor held a reception where Leopoldine was asked to enter the festivities alongside his mistress. While she had done that before, Leopoldine was drained and declined the invitation. Emperor Pedro, who was unable to take a no for an answer, rushed to his wife's chambers and violently grabbed her as he tried to force her out of the room. Bystanders report that he hit and kicked his wife, who was left bruised after the incident. Leopoldine was emotionally and physically drained after years of neglect and abuse. She suffered a miscarriage 2 weeks after the incident and became severely ill. On the 11th of December 1826, Leopoldine succumbed to her sufferings and died at the age of 29. Emperor Pedro wouldn't even attend her funeral, but after the Brazilian public became irritated with his careless behavior, he mimicked the mourning widower for a while. Leopoldine was deeply mourned by the Brazilian people, but her legacy would live on, especially through her son Pedro, who would replace his unpopular father as Pedro II in 1832. Leopoldine's fate is especially tragic to me. She was a hopeful young girl who was intelligent and sensitive. Her determination to be a good wife to a volatile husband is admirable, yet I can't stop to wonder what happened behind the scenes. Her compliance to her husband's temper was probably a good choice to keep his outbursts minimal, yet her devotion didn't keep her safe from his abuse eventually. In the end, her husband was a slave to his overbearing mistress, which brought out his inadequate character even more. We can only speculate how things would have turned out if Domitilla didn't come into their life. Eventually, it's a shame that such a strong, intelligent, and committed woman like Leopoldine was mistreated this badly, yet she represents one of many tragic fates of women her time.